What up, Wizards? It's Deb. I got Ziggy with me, too. We're from Mtg Magic. And today, it's the big one, which is also what they call me. But once per season, we comb through tournament data to bring you a definitive, yet still wholly subjective tier list of all the decks in Standard. And it's about time to do that with just like 2.5 or 3 weeks left until we get to Forgotten Realms spoilers. I probably need to talk about what decks are actually good in Strixhaven. And you might say, hey Dev, Strixhaven didn't really change much when it came out. We got the same meta we've had since the rise of Eldrazi. That's not necessarily true. There's actually a fair amount of evolution that's taken place in this format. You know, powerful decks that have slid down the ranks a little bit, and then decks that really weren't doing a whole heck of a lot a couple of months ago that have gone all the way up to the top tiers. So again, I think that Strixhaven didn't add all the cards in the world to Standard, but it still had an effect on the meta. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Well, actually, I might be getting ahead of myself a little bit because I think there are a couple of more things I have to say to set the table before we really jump into the tier list part of the video. Please forgive me. Now, first thing I want to go ahead and clarify here is that this is a best of 3 tier list. So there might be some best of 1 players that watch the video and they're like, no, what are you talking about, big boy? It's not what we're doing at all. And that's because, again, gentle reminder, just to clear it up, best of 3 tier list that's been crafted by poring over lots and lots of tournament data for the past couple of months since Strixhaven came out. I can't help how these decks finish in tournaments or what their different meta shares are or anything like that. So I tried to be as objective as possible when making the list, but again, subjectivity might creep in here and there, and you might not agree with where I put everything, which is the beauty of tier lists in the first place. But if it looks way off, you might be a best of 1 player. That might be why. I've been enjoying the format a lot myself too. So if you want to see a separate best of 1 tier list and you want that content, let me know in the comments section below. I would be really interested in doing that. But for the time being, we talking best of 3 in this video. So remember that. And I guess the last thing I'll say, and we'll get right to it, I promise, is that if you want links to some of these decks that we talk about today, I will leave links to the top 8 decks in this video in the description below if you're interested in checking any of those out. Plus, a bunch of other links. You know, you can follow me on Twitch through the links in the description, or check out the Patreon, or a bunch of other videos that we've done just recently also in the description. So it's a good place to be, but specifically you want the deck lists, that's where you go. Aside from that, like and subscribe, but that's all I got to say. Let's do it, and I'll see you on the other side. Okay, I want to start by saying that I think there are 4 fairly distinct tiers in Standard comprised of 15 different decks that I think are somewhat playable right now, which is a lot of decks. I believe that is more decks than I've ever included in a single tier list video. But these D tier decks, which we'll start with here, I don't think are bad decks. Again, I think if you made the video, you're a deck that can contend, but all the decks in D tier have different stories, whether they're decks that have seen a lot of play in the meta before, but whose play rate has dropped off recently, or the exact opposite. You know, there are some decks in here, 1 or 2 specifically, whose play rate has gone up recently, but hasn't really produced the tournament results that we need to call it one of the better decks in the format. And that's why most of these decks are ultimately in the D tier, is again, a lack of true tournament results, but still a share of the meta. Now, as we move through the higher tiers on the list, I'm going to focus a little bit more on each deck individually than I will in the D tier. As far as this tier goes, I'm just going to tell you what all decks are in the D tier, and we'll talk briefly about each one of them. I think this tier houses Boros Winota, Mono Green, Rakdos Sacrifice, Jeskai Mutate, Esper Doom, and Dimir Control. But not necessarily in that order. I think if you asked a lot of pro players, they would probably tell you that Jeskai Mutate is the most powerful of these decks, but it is also the one that is getting tournament results the most recently. It was actually seeing some play at the Strixhaven Championship, but it didn't necessarily do great at the Strixhaven Championship either. We actually saw a few different players time out or come very, very close to timing out with this deck. It's a very complex one to pilot, and that is something that's very cool about the deck, and it's an awesome combo that effectively gets to cast Open the Omen Pass like a million times in the same turn. Sweet little deck if you haven't heard about it. I will leave a link to this one in the description as well, because I think of all the decks in the D tier, it probably is the best, but it hasn't necessarily been producing the results that it needs to produce, and there are some aggregating sites that don't even have this as having any meta share whatsoever, but I think that will change. Now, Rakdos Sacrifice is sitting at about 1% of the meta on EtherHub and 1.6% of the meta on MTG Goldfish, so there's not a whole lot of people on this deck, but it has had some pretty good finishes recently. You know, a 7-1 here, a 7-3 there, so it has had some well above 500 percentage points wins in the very recent past. So the deck is doing some things, but it doesn't have anywhere enough meta share or play rate to really put a score on it, but it definitely is a little bit more than just a Brewer's deck at this point. Now, Dimir Control is not a deck you see very often, but apparently it has 2% of the meta on EtherHub and 2.2% of the meta on MTG Goldfish, so there are a few odd players on this deck, even though it hasn't produced a whole lot of amazing tournament results lately. Now, the deck does have a couple of 3-0 finishes at big Magic events, not large-scale Magic events, literally BIG Magic is the name of the event. But these aren't weighted very highly, and as we move through, you'll note that a lot of decks have 6-0 and 5-1 finishes at big Magic events, and sometimes multiples of them. So Dimir Control only having a couple of examples of that is not necessarily impressive. I can see how people are running this deck right now because it seems pretty decent against some of the better decks in the format, but it just really hasn't gotten a foothold yet. Esper Doom, or 4-color Doom in a lot of cases, which is Andrea Mengucci's pet deck, does have 2.5% of the meta according to EtherHub and 2% of the meta according to Goldfish. So again, a deck that not a lot of people are playing, but when you do see Yorion at the very beginning of a game of Arena, you do have to wonder in the back of your mind if they're going to be trying to Doom Foretold you, but it's not a whole lot of players and it's really not producing too many results nowadays. Boris Winota might be a force in best of one, no matter how you build it, basically, but again, not a best of one list. In best of three, this does apparently have 3.5% of the meta on EtherHub, which makes sense because it tracks a lot of arena play, but Goldfish has this at 1.6% of the meta in best of three, which sounds a little bit more reasonable. Again, I can't find a whole lot of really good tournament results recently in best of three for Boris Winota, but it is a deck that has a surprising meta share for a deck that's not posting too many results. And finally, Mono Green, probably the newest in a way of these decks at least. Sometimes you'll see variants of the old Feasting Troll King food decks, and then sometimes you'll just see straight up Stompy with Lovestruck Beasts and Stonecoil Serpents and Primal Mites and all that kind of stuff. So there's a couple of different versions of the deck right now, but according to EtherHub, it's 5.25% of the meta, but Goldfish has it at 2.5%, which is actually a little bit more than I would have thought, because in the last couple of months, Mono Green has really fallen off the map. Mono Green was really good when Rogues was a real force in the format, because it's very good against that deck, but as Rogues has fallen off, so has Mono Green, or at least the food version of the deck. Now that Mono White, Mono Red, various Winota builds, the Naya deck, all of these decks with small low-to-the-ground creatures are getting a little bit more popular nowadays, or at least are holding their popularity. You'll see Mono Green actually begin to creep up in playability because it's a decent mid-range deck that can finish a game against Emergent Ultimatum before they cast the ultimatum, but can also invalidate all of Mono White and Mono Red's small-ish creatures. So Mono Green is somewhat well-positioned in the format right now, but really hasn't created the foothold that it needs in terms of results. Now let's jump into the C tier, where we can focus a little bit more on each deck as we talk about it, but I'm not going to say too much about Jeskai Cycling, our first deck that has a real resume so far, right? This has a 6-3 record at the recent Coupe de France, which is funny because a lot of people call the deck Tour de France, but it also has a 6-0 and a 5-1 at Big Magic recently, a 4-1 at a Maj event, and it was part of a 10-5 record at the Strixhaven Championship. Now, the Strixhaven Championship is very important in determining what the standard meta is going to look like. It's the best of the best, playing what they believe are the best decks at the highest level. Now, that said, the event featured both historic and standard play, so when I say that it 10-5 at Strixhaven Championships, it was part of a 10-5 record at the Strixhaven Championship, also featuring a historic deck. So do keep that in mind, but I think that these decks' championship records are very important to take into account, especially considering it's the biggest tournament of the season. So Cycling was present at that tournament, although not in huge numbers, and honestly it has fallen off the map a little bit. According to MTG Goldfish, it's 2.5% of the meta, and according to EtherHub, interestingly, it has no percent of the meta. It's not listed on their website at all in terms of the standard best of three meta share. So almost no one's playing the deck in Arena, which is understandable, pretty stale play patterns, not actually a whole lot of fun, especially in a format with a ton of counter spells, which we are definitely in. So I think Cycling has fallen off a bit, but it's definitely still worthy of being in C tier, again mostly due to its resume, and it's still getting wins as of recently. With our next deck in C tier, we can talk a little bit about how the mighty do occasionally fall, because the next deck is Rogues, just ahead of Cycling, although I think a good little bump ahead of Cycling. Right now, EtherHub has this at 5% of the meta, Goldfish has it at 5.8% of the meta, so there are still people on this deck. However, it was part of a few 11-4s at Champs, not actually the best records, 2 4-1 finishes at the Latin American tournament recently, and then 2 5-1 Big Magic finishes as well, but the deck has not really done that much outside of some fairly ho-hum results as of the last month or so. Not only that, but its meta share across the board has decreased drastically over the last 4 to 6 weeks or so, when Rogues used to be one of the most feared, prolific, respected, and irritating decks in the format. Now you come up against it way, way less often. But I'm not bagging on Rogues too much, don't mistake me, because this is still a fearsome deck. It's capable of generating really good tempo, it's got a lot of dimension to it, and a lot of different ways it can win the game. So I'm not going to say that Rogues is a bad deck. It can still generate well above a 500-point win percentage at the end of the day. So Rogues ain't bad, but it's just not what it used to be. But up next in C tier is Mono Red, believe it or not. This deck actually still has a pretty respectable meta share, but I don't think it's as good as its meta share would denote. This does have a number of 11-4 finishes at Champs, or at least, again, it was part of a number of 11-4 finishes at the Strixhaven Championships. Aside from that, it's got 4 3-0 finishes at Big Magic events recently, and a 4-1 finish at the Latin America Series. So it does have some relatively high-profile wins lately, although not as many by any stretch, as a lot of the decks will cover in the later tiers. Now, in terms of meta share, this is still crushing on Arena, or at least still seeing a lot of play on Arena at 11% according to EtherHub and 6.6% according to Mtg Goldfish. So even in the higher levels of standard play and tournament play, this is seeing some play, right? 6.6% is not nothing, and especially when it comes to arena play, 11% is an awful lot of the meta. So again, a lot of players are still on this deck, have faith in it, and on a good day it can definitely do great things. With the perfect start and on the play, Mono Red can still win on turn 4 pretty easily, but that's not the kind of reality it used to be with some of the answers we now have. Overall, I'd say that if you have to play aggro right now, there are at least 3 decks in the format that are probably better aggro decks than Mono Red. That said, Mono Red is the most hard-line aggro deck in the format that tries to kill the absolute fastest, and that's probably its greatest benefit and its greatest downfall. On the right start, Mono Red can beat any deck on any day, especially if they stumble and the Mono Red player goes first. However, a lot of the other aggro decks in the format are more well-equipped to dig down, grind harder, and go longer in certain games, and I think that's probably just better in a lot of cases. All that said, though, if all you want to do is put the pedal directly on top of the metal, Mono Red is probably still the best deck in the format for doing that. But heading off C tier, the final deck in this tier at least, we're going to talk about Temur for a minute, which might surprise you a little. Now, EtherHub has Temur at about 5.25% of the meta, whereas Goldfish has it at about 1% of the meta. But despite only being 1% of the meta, it has really produced some great tournament results recently. 8-1 at the Coupe de France, very nice. Part of a 12-3 finish and multiple 10-5 finishes at the Strixhaven Championship, and a 6-0 and a 5-1 respectively at Big Magic events, which are mostly better finishes than Mono Red or Rogues has seen just in the last month or so here. So again, in terms of resume alone over the last 4 weeks, I think that Temur has it over the other decks that we've looked at so far, but I also think this is just a more playable deck in the current meta. However, as we'll see as we go through the ranks here, the top couple of decks have access to counterspells, and decks that play cards like Solid Coming and Mystical Dispute and whatnot are typically quite good against decks trying to resolve a Genesis Ultimatum. So as the playability of counterspells go in a given format, so does Temur a lot of the time. However, this deck does have a lot of adventure creatures and whatnot, so it can get through counter shields and just beat face. There's a lot of dimension to the Temur deck, and there's a lot of different paths to victory, so it's not just relying on Genesis Ultimatum 9 times out of 10. There are a lot of other ways that Temur can win the game and play through counterspell shields. So on a good day, Temur has a good chance against just about everything, but I do think that Temur is a bit tragic in that it looks like one of the better decks in the format. It's got all the adventure creatures, it's got Alrund's Epiphany, it's got Genesis Ultimatum, it's got sometimes Terror of the Peaks, although not as often anymore. It's just got all these great Magic cards, and it was destined to be a great deck, but again, the more decks we see with main deck counterspells at the top of the list, I think the worse Temur gets. But Temur does have a few unique abilities that I really like about it. It's really good at winning card advantage wars, decent when it comes to generating tempo and deploying threats to the board. Deck just has a little bit of everything, right? With a good start, it can just Lovestruck Beast on the play and start beating face, maybe into a Great Hinge or Alrund's Epiphany, and just win the game that way. But it can also win long games where it eventually top decks a Genesis Ultimatum. A lot of cool things about this deck, but it's just not quite there all the way. But let's move into the B tier, the next to last tier. Now we're really getting into some really fantastic decks with some great tournament results for that matter. But every single deck in this tier is an aggro deck, believe it or not. And we'll start with Mono White. A lot of people would have this pegged as the best aggro deck in the format, but its play rate is down a little bit recently, and with its play rate goes some of its better tournament results. It did get a 12-1 record at the F2K United series, and that is a really good record. Aside from that, it was part of numerous 10-5 records at Champs, a 5-1 at Maj, and a 4-1 at Insight Esports events, which are all pretty good results. According to EtherHub, this deck has 4.5% of the meta share in total, and on Goldfish it says it has 7.3% of the meta, which is weird, because I would have thought those numbers would have been switched. I come across this deck on Arena all the time, but I don't see it getting that many tournament results, right? We just saw Temur, the top of the last tier, 1% of the meta share according to MTG Goldfish, great tournament results. Mono White, great tournament results, don't get me wrong, but just not as many as some of the decks that we'll talk about a little bit later. But that said, Mono White is still everything I was talking about a minute ago when I was talking about the Mono Red deck. You know, the Mono Red deck is fast, it's fierce, it gets in as much damage as quickly as possible, at the expense of being able to play late into the game, whereas the Mono White deck may not be able to play super late into the game, but it's far more well equipped at doing that than Mono Red is. I also shouldn't have to tell you that Mono White plays much better against removal than a lot of the other aggro decks in the format, because you got your Seasoned Hallowed Blades, your All Seeds on occasion, and almost always your Selfless Saviors and whatnot, so it'd be very annoying to try to keep creatures off of the board against Mono White, and that's probably its greatest strength right now. That said, cards like Luminarch Aspirant and Maul of the Skyclaves give them the reach that they need to go the distance in a lot of games and either close things out quickly or stall to the point that their board state is too much to deal with from another aggro opponent. But overall, Mono White's just not quite as sexy as it used to be, because we just have what I believe, and a lot of other players believe, to be better aggro options. And some of again, a couple of these aggro decks that come above Mono Red and Mono White, you might be surprised by. But again, I tried to go as much by tournament results, and recent tournament results for that matter, as I could. So when I tell you that the next deck after Mono White is Naya Adventures, I want you to give it a chance, because this deck was part of a 13-2 record at Champs and did very well in the standard portion. 5-0 in an on-curve event, 7-3 at the F2K United event, 4-1 in Insight, and multiple 3-0 finishes at Big Magic. So lots and lots of tournament results just recently for the Naya Adventures deck as it starts to gain steam over the last 4 to 5 weeks. Considering all that, though, it's still only a 2% share of the meta on Arena, where it's been really slow to catch on. It's actually faster to catch on the competitive scene, where it's about 6% of the meta right now. A couple of the decks that we've covered so far have had more meta share, but I really don't weigh meta share too much. Meta share is just really a determinant of what decks people think are the best, and not necessarily an objective measurement of what decks are the best. And I would much rather gather that through looking at tournament data. That said, Naya Adventures just doesn't have a whole lot of meta share right now, but the players that are playing it are having an awful lot of success, and this is a deck with a ton of dimension. This has an amazing 4-drop card draw piece, effectively, in Showdown of the Scalds, which is the glue of the deck, but you see I'm using Clarion Spirit here as the representer for the deck, the representative, I should say. Very important card to the deck. We play things like Jaspera Sentinel to get on board very early, and then just explode with things like Clarion Spirit, Elite Spellbinder, and then get all the cards in the world with Showdown of the Scalds. If the deck is swept, especially if it gets to Showdown, then it can just rebuild its board really easily. Tons of adventure creatures to set the opponent back on tempo, or just get ahead on board ourselves. This is another one of those decks. A little bit like Temur. I think in some ways it's a better version of Temur that fills the board faster, has better early turns and whatnot. Whereas Temur just wants to Bone Crusher, Brazen Bar, or Edgewall and Keeper Heart's Desire on the first few turns. This deck is doing all kinds of stuff. It can Bone Crusher you too if it wants to, but it can also Clarion Spirit, just Jaspera Sentinel, any number of 1 and 2 drops. Just a really volatile deck that has a lot of really busted starts and can go late into the game thanks to its card advantage. So just a fantastic deck that really leverages cards like Elite Spellbinder and Clarion Spirit very, very well. But at the top of B tier, oh how the mighty have risen back to the top in a completely different form. The Frieza of this list is Gruul Aggro, which, you know, really did not generate a whole lot of playtime for a few weeks there, but in the last 4 weeks or so, this deck has really come back with a vengeance because it's been fixed. They made it stronger, faster, more versatile, all those things. And even though it's not necessarily the $6 million deck, it still does a lot of really cool stuff really efficiently too. As a matter of fact, you might not be surprised by this inclusion on the list because right now, EtherHub has this at a 10% share of the meta and Goldfish has it at 6%, which is lower, but this deck has generated a lot of good results. Part of a 12 and 3 finish at Champs, numerous 10 and 5s too. Did fairly well in the standard portion of the event, 5 and 1 at an Insight, 5 and 2 at the Coupe de France, 6 and 0 at a Big Magic, and 5 and 1 at another Big Magic, including another finish 4 and 1 at an Insight Esports event. So a lot of results for Gruul Aggro recently, and again, different forms. Sometimes you'll still see the old Kazandu Mammoth, Brushfire Elemental builds that we saw last season, but more often now, you'll see the build that involves Magda and Asika's Chariot, kind of a weird looking build, but Asika's Chariot is a completely busted card right now, and Magda actually has not been too bad either for providing a little bit of ramp, and especially on the play. Magda can be a fantastic card. This deck has access to a lot of threats. Bone Crusher Giant, Lovestruck Beast, Edgewall Innkeeper, all that stuff is on the menu. Occasionally Goldspan Dragon, just a lot of good threats at pretty much every point on the curve. If it gets the right start, it can kill you quickly, but it can also kind of sit back and just rely on the Great Hinge, Embercleave when top decked into, and all that stuff, just like the old Gruul deck can do, and kill you that way. So again, very versatile aggro deck that can go fairly deep into the game, and I like its game plan past turn 5 or 6, but there's also the odd gamer who just kills you on the play on turn 5. But now we have reached the pinnacle, ladies and gentlemen, and here's a deck that you probably expected, although I'm not sure that you expected it, to be all the way up here in the annals of A tier. We have Izzet Dragons, or Prismari Dragons. Is it Tempo? Is it Control? Whatever you call the deck. This has really experienced a rise in play recently, and Izzet Tempo was an important deck. Even during the last season of play, during Kaldheim Standard, but wasn't necessarily one of the top decks in the format ever. It probably would have been one of the D tier decks last season. However, in the last really 3 to 4 weeks, in the very, very recent past, this deck has done a lot of very impressive things. It was part of a 13 and 2 record at Champs and numerous other winning records at that tournament. A lot of 10 and 5s and whatnot. Just tons and tons of above 500 percentage point, performances by the Izzet Dragons deck at that tournament. It should tell you a lot that so many pros were on this deck and decided that it was a meta breaker at that tournament, because I do believe that it is as well. I think it was a good call. This deck also has a 6 and 0 at an Inside event, the only deck to get a perfect record at an Inside event we'll talk about. 5 and 1 at a Maj, 5 and 1 at a Big Magic event. So lots and lots of really high profile wins just recently for the Izzet Dragons deck, and it's showing its Strixhaven Championship, I think, really cemented its place in the meta now. And since the Strixhaven Championships, actually a little bit before the Strixhaven Championships, but especially since the Strixhaven Championships, the deck has exploded in popularity. It now holds an 8.65 meta share on EtherHub, and get this, Mtg Goldfish has this at a 22.5% share of the meta. Very, very high meta share. According to Mtg Goldfish, the deck is seeing tons and tons of play in the last few weeks, especially as people were getting ready for the Strixhaven Championship. And now the deck is in the kind of position where I actually think it might one day, right before Forgotten Realms comes out, be the de facto best deck in the format, mostly because it's so good against the Sultai matchup. The deck has plenty of sideboard sweepers for when it does come up against aggro, but I think the deck does a really good job of balancing being a tempo/control deck and being a deck that actually wants to attack with its creatures, right? Sometimes you actually want to get in with the Brazen Borrowers, the Bone Crusher Giants, the Galazeth Prismaris, the Goldspan Dragons, and all that stuff. You'll just win the game that way. You'll cast an Alrund's Epiphany off the back of a Goldspan, win games. So that's one way of doing it. That's actually 3 or 4 ways of doing it. I've just listed off. But if all goes, if all is lost, you can also win the game with a Faceless Haven. Maybe you can lock down the board state and then win off of Faceless Haven. Another really important avenue to victory the deck has access to. But in the meantime, you're countering ultimatums and other large-scale spells from the opponent and whatnot. And this deck is just very well equipped at this particular moment in the meta to not only have plenty of game against the ultimatum builds because they just counter them into the dirt, but also have decent play against some of these aggro decks, right? Because you've got early game removal and good tempo against those aggro decks, and eventually you just go over the top of them with Goldspan, Alrund's Epiphany, Brazen Bar, and whatnot. Literally over the top with flyers in this case, but also over the top in the traditional sense. You have bigger cards than an aggro deck typically does, so you can go over the top in that way too. So just a really well-positioned deck right now in terms of what the meta is doing outside of it. But to finish it off, and you knew we'd get here, we are at number 1, and that is Sultai. It has to be Sultai. Right now, this deck has a 16% meta share on EtherHub, which when we're talking about Arena and just the way EtherHub aggregates its decks, that's actually a huge meta share, right? It has a bigger meta share on MTG Goldfish. Apparently, it's 23% of the meta, 1/2 a percentage point more than Izzet Dragons at this point. But you would expect a lot of pro players to be on this deck. Arena tends to be, outside of tournaments and whatnot, Arena tends to be a much more diverse meta than typical competitive play. Even on the ladder, you'll occasionally run into, a mono black Hateful Eidolon with Lurrus or something like that, these off-meta decks that you just don't really see very often in competitive play. So for that environment to host a 16% meta share of the Sultai deck is actually saying quite a bit, but so is a 23% meta share on Goldfish. That's nearly a quarter of the meta. That's a very popular deck, and you can see why. It was part of numerous 11-4 wins at Champs. Now, honestly, a lot of people expected the deck to have a better record at Champs than that. This is not the best Champs record that we've discussed so far, but multiple 11-4 finishes definitely puts it well above the 500 club. It's got 2 different 6-0s at Big Magics, including a 5-1 as well at those events. 2 different 4-1 finishes at Inside Esports and a 4-1 at the Latin America event, plus a decent finish at the Maj series. So just about every major tournament you can name in the last 4 to 6 weeks, this deck has showed up at big. It is the de facto best deck in the format, and I really don't think that's a surprise to anybody. It actually did get some new tricks from Strixhaven as well. We got things like Professor Onyx for this deck that are actually really sweet. Sometimes you'll even see Blood on the Snow in an odd list here or there, but Strixhaven did add a few cards to this list. As a matter of fact, Strixhaven added a few cards to nearly every list in this video. Like not only did Izzet Dragons get Galazeth Prismari, but sometimes you'll see Prismari Command, and you'll always see 3 to 4 copies of Expressive Iteration, a card that's only just now taking a foothold in the format when it's very obviously a busted Magic card. I don't know why it took everybody so long. But but in any case, back to Sultai for the time being. This deck did get, I guess, cemented in its place by the release of Strixhaven, getting a couple of new tricks here and there, a couple of new pieces. But all in all, the deck has been stalwart since Kaldheim came out and it got access to Binding the Old Gods. That really changed everything, and ever since then, this deck has been at the top of the mountain. Even though I think Izzet Dragons is one of the better matchups for it in the format, I still don't think that any decks showing at this point in the format has been enough to knock Sultai off of its perch. Now, the last thing I'll say is that I have seen a lot of people with the take lately. Actually, I just saw a very popular content creator with this take just a couple of days ago, but I've seen other people with this take on Twitter and Reddit and other forms of social media, even again, other content creators here on YouTube, that they like Strixhaven more than they thought they were going to at first, right? A lot of people gave this set a bad rap when it first came out. And again, even though it didn't affect Standard on a huge level, it affected Standard in some really interesting ways upon release, and will probably affect Standard in some really cool ways after rotation. We have that to look forward to, but even for just now, Strixhaven did a lot of cool stuff, and I'm just now hearing a lot of content creators and pros even pipe up and say, hey, maybe Strixhaven ain't so bad, and if only somebody had tried to tell you that. Anyway, that's all my thoughts for now. I know there's a couple of weird ones, but I will try to assuage you by saying that, is that even a word people use? that a lot of where this stuff ended up on the list surprises me. It really does. I didn't expect Teamer to be ahead of Mono Red. I didn't expect Naya Adventures to be ahead of Mono White. But when you really get down and start digging through tournament results, it kind of just is what it is. You know, I try to be as objective as possible when I make these lists, and I'm very surprised by some of these placements. So don't come at me too hard, but definitely let me know how you felt still down there in the comments section about all this stuff. Any decks that maybe I missed, let me know about. People still play Naya Fury out there? I guess a couple of you probably. Aside from that, remember, check out the description for deck lists and a bunch of other stuff down there. Check out the Patreon if you want to. $1 a month to support the channel. You can vote on what content we do around here. And you can watch me play Magic on Twitch at twitch.tv/SBMTGdev. But that's it for now. Just go down there and tear me apart if you want to. But again, I try to be as objective as possible. But that's all I've got for this one. Next up is going to be the top 3 off-meta decks in the format. One of my favorite videos to do every season. So make sure you're subbed for all that stuff and like the video if you get a chance. Aside from that, I guess I'm done here. So I'll catch you cats later. I'm Dev from The Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.